Some men spend their whole lives quietly, and Walter White was one of them. Right up until the year he turned 50 and decided he had run out of time. He was a high school chemistry teacher in New Mexico, a man who had once helped build a company and then sold his share of it for $5,000, only to watch it grow into something worth billions without him. He took a second job washing cars. He worked out, down to the dollar, exactly how much money his family would need after he was gone. And then, when a doctor told him he was going to live after all, he walked into a quiet bathroom and hit his own reflection until his knuckles bled. Tonight, slowly and carefully, the full story of why this ordinary man could never walk away. The wound he carried, the choices he made, and the truth he hid until the very end. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get started. Section 1. The Man Who Sold His Future for $5,000. To understand why Walter White could never stop, the story has to begin long before any of the things he became famous for. It has to begin before the cancer, before the drugs, before the name that frightened a whole city. It has to begin with a much younger man, in a much quieter life, making one small decision that he would spend the rest of his days trying to undo without ever admitting that was what he was doing. When the show first introduces Walt, he looks like the least dangerous man alive. He is gentle. He is tired. He shuffles through his days at a school where teenagers barely listen to him. And then he drives to a car wash and takes a second job to make ends meet. His clothes are dull. His voice is soft. Everything about him seems built to be overlooked. And for years, that is exactly what happens to him. He is the kind of man people forget the moment they walk away from a conversation. And for a long time, that is how the audience is meant to see him too, as a harmless and slightly sad figure who deserves a little sympathy. But underneath that quiet surface, something old has been sitting for decades, and it has been slowly turning sour. Years before the show begins, Walter White was not a tired teacher. He was a brilliant young scientist, one of the sharpest minds in his field, studying at one of the best science schools in the country. There he met a friend named Elliot Schwartz, and the two of them became close. They were partners in the truest sense, working side by side on their research, sharing ideas, building something together. Their work even contributed to a study that helped win a Nobel Prize, which is one of the highest honors a scientist can ever receive. These were not ordinary men doing ordinary things. They were young, gifted, and standing at the very start of what should have been an enormous life. When they finished school, the two friends decided to start a company of their own. They called it Gray Matter Technologies. The name was a quiet little joke between them, the kind of private cleverness that close friends share. Elliot means black in another language, and combined with the name White, the two together make gray. So the company carried both of their names folded into one word, a sign that this was meant to be a shared dream, built by the two of them, owned by the two of them, carried forward by the two of them. Around this time, Walt also fell in love. Her name was Gretchen. She worked alongside him as his lab assistant, and she matched him in intelligence in a way few people ever had. They were equals in the lab, and they became partners in life. They fell deeply in love. They got engaged. For a brief window, the young Walter White had everything a person could reasonably want. He had genius. He had a best friend. He had a company with his name on it. And he had a woman he planned to marry. The future in front of him was wide open and bright. and then he walked away from all of it. The exact reason is something the show holds back on purpose, and it is worth being honest about that. The series never sits the audience down and explains in plain words what happened on the day Walt left. What it gives instead are pieces, scattered across different episodes, that have to be gathered and held up to the light. The people who made the show have said since that the full picture can be put together if a person watches closely enough, and that the point was never the exact event, so much as the fact that Walt never let go of it. So what follows is built from those pieces, and where the record is incomplete, it deserves to be named as incomplete. What the show does make clear is this: Gretchen came from a wealthy family. Walt did not. During a holiday weekend spent at her family home, surrounded by her family's money and comfort and ease, something inside Walt curdled. He felt small. He felt that he did not belong, that he was beneath them, that whatever he had built with his own mind was nothing next to the world she had been born into. That feeling, the feeling of being less than the people around him, was something he could not stand. And rather than talk about it, rather than work through it, he simply left. He left Gretchen with no real explanation. He pulled himself out of the relationship and out of the life they had planned, and he gave no one a true reason why. Then he sold his share of the company. He sold it to Elliot for $5,000. At the time, Walt would later say, that was a meaningful amount of money to him. $5,000 felt like something. So he took it. He signed away his piece of gray matter technologies, and he walked out the door, believing, perhaps, that he was making a clean and reasonable choice. He told people only that his reasons were personal. He did not explain. He simply removed himself from the future he had helped to build. What happened next is the part that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elliot and Gretchen grew closer after Walt left. In time, they fell in love, married, and ran the company together. And the company did not stay small. Gray matter technologies grew and grew and kept growing until it was worth more than $2 billion. Elliot and Gretchen became extraordinarily rich. They became respected, celebrated, the sort of people invited to speak on television about their success. The company that carried Walt's own name, the company he had helped to imagine, became one of the great triumphs of their field. And Walter White had no part in any of it. He had traded the whole thing away for $5,000 and a feeling he refused to examine. While they built an empire, Walt became a high school teacher. There is nothing shameful about teaching. It is honest and important work. But for a man who once stood at the edge of greatness, who once won recognition at the highest level of his field, who once owned a slice of something that turned into billions, the classroom felt like a cage. Every day he stood in front of bored teenagers and explained the basics of chemistry. The same simple lessons over and over, knowing in his bones that he had been meant for far more. He watched the life he gave up flourish in someone else's hands. He measured himself against what might have been, and the gap between the two grew wider every single year. And here is the thing that reveals exactly who Walt was, long before he ever cooked a single batch of anything. He did not blame himself. He chose to leave. The decision was his, made freely, for reasons that lived entirely inside his own pride. Nobody pushed him out. Nobody cheated him on the way through the door. He sold his share willingly. Yet as the years passed, Walt quietly rewrote the story in his own head. He came to believe that Elliot and Gretchen had cut him out, that they had taken his work and his ideas and built their fortune on top of them while leaving him behind. He told himself he had been wronged. He nursed a private sense of injury that the facts simply did not support. On the surface, he stayed friendly with both of them, polite and warm whenever they crossed paths. Underneath, he carried a deep and bitter resentment that he never let anyone see. How deep that resentment ran becomes clear in a small and almost sad habit the show reveals later. Walt checks the worth of gray matter technologies regularly, tracking the company's value as it climbs higher and higher. He keeps an eye on the fortune he could have shared. He watches the number grow year after year, like a man pressing on a bruise to make sure it still hurts. That is not the behavior of someone who has moved on. That is the behavior of someone whose entire sense of self has been organized around a single loss that he will not stop reliving. There is one quiet moment from his past, shown in a brief flashback, that makes the loss feel even heavier. Long ago, in a dim classroom, Walt and Gretchen sat together trying to break the human body down into the exact chemicals that make it up. They listed the elements one by one, adding up the percentages, trying to account for everything a person is made of. When they finished, their total came up just a tiny fraction short of 100%. There was a small piece missing, a sliver they could not name with chemistry. And Gretchen, looking at that little gap, wondered aloud whether the missing piece might be the soul. It is a tender memory. It shows a younger Walt, who was capable of closeness, of wonder, of love. It shows what he had and what he chose to throw away. The man in that memory and the man checking a stock price out of bitterness years later are the same person, and the distance between them is the real story. The wound surfaces directly in an early episode that brings gray matter back into Walt's life. At a birthday party, surrounded by Elliot's wealth, Walt is offered something that should look like kindness. Elliot offers him a job at the company. After Walt's cancer is known, Elliot and Gretchen even offer to pay for his treatment, to quietly cover the enormous medical bills so that money would not be a worry. It is a generous offer. For a man with no savings and a deadly illness, it could have changed everything. It could have saved his family from financial ruin without a single crime. Walt says no. He turns it all down, and he does it because accepting would mean admitting he needs them. It would mean standing in their charity, taking their money, confirming the very thing he could not bear to feel, that he was the lesser man. His pride will not allow it. He would rather refuse help and let his family face disaster than accept a gift that makes him feel small. And then, to hide what he is actually doing, he lies to his own wife. He tells her that Elliot is paying for his treatment, when in truth, the money is coming from somewhere far darker. The offer of a clean and easy way out arrives early, and Walt waves it away without a second thought, because the way out came wrapped in the one thing he hated most, the feeling of being beneath someone else. So before there was any cancer, before there was any meth, before there was any name that made grown men afraid, there was simply this: a proud man who had already lost the life he believed he deserved, who blamed everyone but himself for that loss, and who carried the bitterness of it quietly into middle age. He had tasted greatness once and let it slip away. He had felt the sting of being looked down upon and had never recovered from it. And buried inside him, underneath the soft voice and the dull clothes and the tired eyes, was a hunger that had been starved for 20 years. A hunger to be the great man he was certain he was always meant to become. That hunger is the engine of everything that follows. Every refusal to quit, every dangerous choice, every moment when a normal person would have stopped and Walt kept going instead, traces back to this. He could not stand to be small. He had been small once by his own hand, and the regret of it never stopped burning. So when life finally handed him a chance to feel large again, to be the best at something, to matter, he was never going to let it go. The decision to sell gray matter for $5,000 was the first time he gave up his future. He spent the rest of his life making sure he would never do that again. But none of this would have been set in motion without one phone call, one appointment, and one piece of news delivered in a cold and ordinary doctor's office. The wound had been sitting quietly for decades. It took a death sentence to wake it up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So, before the cancer and before the crime, there was a proud man who had already lost the future he believed was his, and who never stopped quietly blaming the world for a choice he made himself. Next comes the phone call in a doctor's office that gave that buried hunger a reason to wake up. And the exact dollar figure Walt decided his entire life was worth. Section 2. A diagnosis and a number. A man's 50th birthday is supposed to be a small celebration. For Walter White, it began like any other tired morning. There was breakfast at the kitchen table, made by his wife, with veggie bacon arranged on the plate to spell out his new age. A gentle little joke about getting older and watching his health. There was his teenage son, who lived with a physical disability and moved through the world with more grace than most people gave him credit for. There was his wife, pregnant with a child they had not exactly planned, already worrying quietly about money. It was a normal family in a normal house on a normal day. Nothing about that morning suggested that the man at the table was about to become one of the most dangerous people in his city. The life around him was thin and stretched. Walt taught chemistry to teenagers who barely looked up from their desks, and the work paid so little that he had taken a second job at a local car wash to bring in extra money. After school, he would change out of his teacher's clothes and stand outside in the sun, wiping down the cars of people who sometimes turned out to be his own students. The humiliation of it sat on him quietly. Here was a man who had once helped build a company worth billions, now drying strangers' tires for a few dollars an hour, hoping his boss would not ask him to stay late again. Money was always close to the surface in that house. The mortgage had to be paid. The new baby would need everything a baby needs. His son was getting older and would want to go to college one day. And every family in their situation knew that a single piece of bad luck, a lost job or a serious illness, could tip them from getting by into real trouble. Walt carried all of that weight in silence, the way he carried everything, never quite saying out loud how afraid he was that he was failing the people who depended on him. Then the bad luck came, and it was worse than anything he had imagined. It started with a cough that would not go away, and a sudden collapse that sent him to the hospital. The tests came back, and a doctor sat him down to deliver the kind of news that splits a life into a before and an after. Walt had lung cancer. It was advanced, already at a serious stage, and the outlook was grim. He was given roughly 2 years to live, maybe less. He had never been a heavy smoker. He had done little to deserve it. The disease simply arrived, uninvited, and handed him a deadline he had not asked for. For a moment, sitting in that cold office, Walter White was just a frightened man, hearing that he was going to die. What he did next says a great deal about who he was. He did not break down in front of his family. He did not gather them close and share the fear. Instead, he went quiet. He kept the diagnosis to himself for a while, turning it over alone, unable or unwilling to let anyone see how shaken he was. The habit of hiding, of carrying things privately rather than admitting weakness. was already deep in him. He had hidden his bitterness about the company for 20 years. Now he hid his own death sentence from the people who loved him most. But the diagnosis did something else to Walt, something quieter and stranger that would shape everything to come. A man who believes he has only a short time left begins to feel oddly free. The ordinary rules that hold most people in place, the fear of getting caught, the worry about the future, the dread of losing what they have, all of it loosens its grip when the future itself has been taken away. If a person is going to die soon anyway, then what exactly is there left to be afraid of? That dark kind of freedom settled into Walt, and it gave the hunger he had buried for decades a sudden and dangerous room to move. The path forward arrived almost by accident, through his own brother-in-law. Hank worked for the agency that fights the drug trade, and he was loud and proud about his job, in the way Walt never was about anything. To cheer Walt up, or perhaps just to show off, Hank invited him along on a real operation, a chance to watch the agents raid a house used to make illegal drugs. Walt agreed, and what he saw that day changed the direction of his life. He watched the agents bring out the evidence, and among that evidence was money, stacks and stacks of cash. Far more than a small operation like that should reasonably hold. The numbers stunned him. A modest setup, run by people who were nowhere near as smart as he was, had been pulling in sums that dwarfed his teacher's salary. And then came the second shock. As the raid unfolded, Walt spotted a familiar face slipping out a window and escaping down the street. It was a young man named Jesse Pinkman, a former student of his, a boy who had drifted out of school and into exactly this world. Jesse was no genius. Walt had watched him struggle in class. Yet here was Jesse, free and making money in a trade that Walt, with his brilliant mind, could surely master far better. The idea took hold of him right there. A man with 2 years to live, a chemist of real talent, could step into this hidden world, make a fortune quickly, and leave that fortune behind for his family before the cancer took him. The plan had a terrible logic to it. It used the one thing Walt had always been good at, his command of chemistry, and it answered the one fear that had been gnawing at him for years, the fear of leaving his family with nothing. So Walt found Jesse, and he made his offer. The respected teacher and the dropout student would become partners. Walt would use his knowledge to make a product purer and better than anything on the street, and Jesse, who already knew the buyers and the sellers, would handle the selling. It was an unlikely pairing, the careful older man and the chaotic younger one, and their partnership would become one of the strangest and most important relationships in the whole story. But at the start, it was simply a business arrangement built on need. Walt needed Jesse's connections. Jesse needed Walt's skill. When anyone asked Walt why he was doing it, he had an answer ready. And for a long time, it was the only answer he gave. He was doing it for his family. He said it to Jesse. He said it, in time, to his wife. He said it to himself most of all. He wanted to know that when he was gone, the mortgage would be paid and the house would be safe. He wanted his son to be able to go to college. He wanted his new baby to grow up without the shadow of poverty. He wanted his wife to be able to breathe. After a lifetime of feeling like a man who could not provide, he had finally found a way to provide on a scale he had never dreamed of. And he wrapped the whole dangerous scheme in the language of love and duty. And then he did something that captures the whole tragedy in a single act. He sat down and calculated a number. Walt, ever the careful thinker, worked out exactly how much money his family would need to be secure for the next 20 years. He added up the mortgage, The cost of raising and educating his children, the everyday expenses of a household left without its main earner, the cushion against future emergencies. He ran the figures the way he ran everything, in his head, with precision. And he arrived at a sum. $737,000. That was the target. That was the amount that would let him die in peace, knowing he had done his job. He told himself a simple thing. Once he reached that number, he would stop. He would walk away from the whole dangerous world, hand the money to his family, and spend his final months as an ordinary husband and father. That number matters more than almost anything else in the early part of the story, because it proves that at this stage, Walt still believed there was a place to stop. The plan had an ending built into it. There was a line drawn in the sand, a finish point, a moment when enough would truly be enough. $737,000 and not a dollar more. If the family was the real and only reason, then the day he reached that figure would be the day he quit. He would reach it, and he would not quit. But that comes later. There was already, even at the very beginning, a crack in the family story, and a careful eye can spot it. When Jesse questioned him about why a respectable man with a wife and a home and a steady job would risk everything to cook drugs, Walt did not only talk about money. He admitted something more honest, almost without meaning to. He said that doing this made him feel awake. He said it made him feel alive. After years of standing in classrooms reciting the same lessons, after years of feeling invisible and overlooked and small, the danger and the skill and the secret power of this new life lit something inside him that had been cold for a very long time. The work was thrilling. The work was his. For the first time in 20 years, Walter White felt like he mattered. That admission is the thread that ties this moment back to the wound at the heart of the first chapter. The hunger that had been starving since the day he sold his share of gray matter for $5,000 had finally found something to feed on. The family provided the reason he could say out loud, the noble cover that let him feel good about himself. The feeling of being alive again provided the reason he could not say, the private hunger that the cancer had set loose. Both were real. That is the part people often miss. The love for his family was genuine. The fear of leaving them with nothing was genuine. Walt was not lying when he spoke of them. He simply was not telling the whole truth. And the part he left out was the part that would never let him stop. The honest version of the story, the version Walt himself believed in these early days, goes like this. A dying man does a terrible thing for a good reason. Plans to do it only for as long as he must, sets a clear limit, and intends to return to his quiet life once the debt to his family is paid. If that version had been the whole of him, the story would have been short and sad and almost forgivable. He would have made his money, hit his number, and stopped. There would have been no empire. There would have been no city full of frightened people. There would have been no trail of bodies. But the man making that plan was the same man who had spent 2 decades unable to forgive himself for one act of pride. The same man who checked the worth of a company he had abandoned. The same man who would rather refuse a gift than admit he needed help. The cancer gave him a reason and a strange freedom. The money gave him a goal. The work gave him back the feeling of being someone. And underneath all of it, the old, starved hunger to be great, to be the best, to never again be small, began quietly to grow. A plan to make money for a family is one thing. A man can do that and remain more or less himself. But the world Walt had chosen to step into did not deal in clean money and clean exits. It dealt in fear and threat and violence, and it would not be long before that world placed Walter White in a small, dark room with another human being and a single, impossible question. What do you do when the only way to protect the plan and the family and the secret is to end a life with your own hands? The teacher who fainted at the news of his own illness was about to discover exactly what he was capable of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a dying man found his reason and his number, and told himself he would stop the day he reached it, never quite admitting how alive the danger already made him feel. Next comes the basement and a captured man, and the first time Walt had to decide whether he could take a life to protect his secret. It is the moment the teacher learned what he truly was. Section 3. The basement and the first line crossed. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a basement when something terrible is happening inside it. For most of his life, Walter White had never known that silence. He had spent his days in classrooms and kitchens and the bright open bays of a car wash, ordinary places filled with ordinary sounds. Now he stood at the bottom of a set of wooden stairs in a dim and musty room, and the only sound was the breathing of a man he was supposed to kill. Nothing in 50 years of teaching chemistry and grading homework had prepared him for this. And yet here he was, a husband and a father and a science teacher, trying to work out whether he had it in him to end another person's life with his bare hands. The road to that basement had been short and brutal. Walt and Jesse had set out to make money in the simplest way they could imagine, by cooking their product in an old camper out in the desert and selling it through Jesse's contacts. But the world they had stepped into did not run on simple plans. Their very first real attempt to move up in that world went wrong almost at once. Two dangerous men, dealers who had no patience for newcomers, came out to the desert intending to take what Walt and Jesse had made and most likely kill them both for good measure. The two amateurs were cornered, outnumbered, and out of their depth. It was Walt's mind that saved them. Drawing on his chemistry, he mixed together chemicals that produced a deadly gas, filling the camper with poison while he and Jesse scrambled clear. One of the two men, named Emilio, died from it. The other, a dealer known as Crazy 8, whose real name was Domingo, survived. He was left alive but sick, collapsed and weakened, but breathing. And so, in the space of a single afternoon, Walt had gone from a man who had never seriously hurt anyone to a man with one dead body and one living problem on his hands. The dead body was its own nightmare. Jesse was given the job of getting rid of Emilio's remains, and the way he chose to do it became one of the most stomach-turning moments in the whole early stretch of the story. Rather than follow Walt's careful instructions about what kind of container to use, Jesse tried to dissolve the body using powerful acid in his own upstairs bathtub. The acid did its work on the body, but it also ate straight through the tub and the floor beneath it, sending a horrifying mess crashing down through the ceiling. It was grim and grotesque, and it taught both men an early lesson about how quickly this work turned the human body into a problem to be solved. But disposing of the dead, as awful as it was, did not require Walt to look a living person in the eye. The other half of the problem did. Crazy 8 was alive, and he had seen their faces, and he knew what they were doing. He could not simply be released, because a man like that, set free, would come back for revenge, or send others to do it. The logic of the criminal world was cold and clear. The only safe thing to do with him was to make sure he never walked out. So they chained him in the basement of Jesse's house, a heavy bicycle lock fastened around his neck and looped around a sturdy post. And they left him there. And then came the question neither of them wanted. Someone had to do the killing. Jesse could not. The job fell to Walt. Walt did not want to do it either. This is one of the most important things to understand about him at this stage of the story. He was not eager. He was not cold. He was a man in genuine torment, standing at the edge of something he had never imagined himself capable of, desperately hoping to find a way around it. The teacher in him, the husband, the gentle and careful man who had fainted at his own diagnosis, recoiled from the thought of taking a life on purpose. And so he did what a careful, thoughtful person does when faced with an impossible choice. He made a list. On a sheet of paper, he drew a line down the middle. On one side, he wrote the reasons to let the man live. On the other side, he wrote the reasons to kill him. The side for sparing him filled up quickly, line after line. It was the moral thing to do. Murder was wrong. He was not a killer. Every human life carried weight and deserved protection. The man might be reasoned with. The act would haunt him forever. Reason after reason after reason piled up in favor of mercy. And on the other side of the line, the side for killing, Walt could find only a single entry. If you let the man go, the man would murder his entire family. One reason against many, but that one reason was the whole world to Walt. Everything he had told himself this was for, every justification he had wrapped around his crimes, came down to the safety of the people he loved. A dozen moral arguments sat on one side of the page, and on the other side sat the lives of his wife and his children. And there was no contest. The list did not really decide anything. It only showed, in Walt's own careful handwriting, the exact shape of the trap he was in. Still, he searched for another way. He could not bring himself to simply do it. So he began visiting the prisoner, bringing him food, sitting with him, talking. And something unexpected happened in those conversations. Crazy 8 turned out to be a person. He had a family of his own. He had a life and a history and a sense of humor. He and Walt found small things in common, ordinary human things, and a strange and uneasy bond began to form between the captor and the captive. The more they talked, the harder it became for Walt to imagine going through with it. He began to convince himself that maybe this man could be trusted, that maybe he could be released and would simply disappear, that maybe Walt would not have to become a murderer after all. He wanted that so badly that he nearly talked himself into it. He had all but decided to set the man free. He went so far as to prepare to cut the lock from around his neck. And then he remembered the plate. Earlier, Walt had brought food down on a plate, and at some point that plate had broken. When he later gathered up the pieces, a sharp shard of it had gone missing. At the time, it had seemed like nothing. Now, standing at the top of the stairs with a way to free his prisoner in hand, the missing piece came back to him with sickening force. There was only one explanation for where it had gone. Crazy 8 had taken it. He had hidden a weapon. He had been sitting in that basement, talking warmly with Walt, building a friendship, all while keeping a jagged blade tucked away for the moment his chains came off. The kindness had been a performance. The bond had been a trap. And Walt understood in that cold instant that if he walked down those stairs and freed the man as planned, he would not be saving a life. He would be ending his own. What followed was not clean, and it was not easy. Walt went down into the basement. He confronted the truth of the situation, and the truth confirmed itself. The two men struggled. Walt pulled the bicycle lock tight around the other man's neck and held it, while the man fought and clawed and tried to reach him with the hidden shard. It went on far longer than killing looks in most stories. It was slow and ugly and intimate. Two human beings locked together in a desperate fight, one of them choking the life out of the other. And when it was finally over, when the body went still, Walter White did not stand up feeling powerful. He broke down. He wept. He apologized to the dead man, even as he held him. He was shattered by what his own hands had just done. That moment in the basement is the true beginning of everything dark that comes after. And it is worth being clear about why. The gas in the desert had been panic. It had been a cornered man lashing out to survive, an act of self-defense in a single terrified moment. There is a version of that story where Walt is simply a frightened person who reacted to a deadly threat. The basement was different in every way that matters. The basement was slow. The basement was considered. Walt had days to think about it. He made a list. He weighed it out. He looked the man in the eyes and shared meals with him and learned his name. And then, with full knowledge of what he was doing, he killed him anyway. It was a decision made by a thinking man, carried out by his own hands. And here is the part that should sit heaviest. Walt survived it. Not just physically. He survived it inside. He wept and he carried the weight of it, and it cost him something real. But he did not fall apart for good. He did not turn himself in. He did not abandon the whole plan in horror. He absorbed the act, terrible as it was, and he kept going. He folded the killing into himself and continued down the road he had chosen. That ability, the ability to do something monstrous and then keep living as though he could still be the man he used to be, is one of the most frightening things about him. Most people could never cross that line. Walt crossed it, grieved it, and walked on. Some who study the show closely argue that this capacity was never new, that it had been hiding inside Walt all along, beneath the soft voice and the dull clothes. They point out that even in these earliest episodes, before any real transformation could have taken place, Walt was already capable of killing. The man people remember as a harmless teacher was, in this reading, never truly harmless at all. The show itself does not settle the question. It leaves room for the idea that the meekness was a kind of mask, worn for so long that even Walt believed it, and that the cancer and the crime simply gave the real man underneath permission to step forward. Whether the darkness was always there, or whether it grew, is a question the series deliberately refuses to answer cleanly. And that refusal is part of what makes Walt so unsettling to think about. It is also worth remembering, in the middle of all this horror, who Walt had once been. This was the same chapter of the story where the show looked back to a younger Walter, a man who once sat in a quiet classroom with a woman he loved, gently trying to measure what a human being is made of, wondering together where the soul might hide. That tender memory and the bloody struggle in the basement belong to the same man. The distance between them is the whole tragedy. A person who once searched for the soul in the human body was now squeezing the life out of one with a chain. But for all the weight he carried out of that basement, Walt still had something to hold on to. A story that let him live with himself. He was a dying man. His time was short. Whatever terrible things he did, he told himself, he was doing them quickly, for his family, in the small window left before the cancer claimed him. The killing was monstrous, but in his own mind, it served a clock that was already running out. He could bear the guilt because he believed the whole nightmare had an end built into it. An end that was coming for him, whether he liked it or not. That belief was about to be tested in the cruelest way imaginable. Walt had learned, in the dark, that he could take a life and keep breathing. He had not yet learned what he would become once his last excuse was stripped away. because soon a doctor would deliver a very different kind of news. And Walter White would discover that the most dangerous thing in the world is a man who has run out of reasons to stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So in a dim basement, a gentle teacher learned the most dangerous truth about himself: that he could end a life with his own hands and still go on living. He carried the guilt, but he kept his excuse, the comfort of a clock already running down. Next comes the day a doctor took even that comfort away, and the quiet bathroom where the real Walter White finally showed his face. Section 4. 4 days out and the excuse that vanished. Most people only have to face their own death once. In the desert, far from any road, Walter White faced his twice. The second time would change everything, but it began with the first, out under an enormous empty sky, in a broken-down camper, with a man who was certain his life was about to end. The episode that holds the turning point of the whole story starts in a quiet and almost gentle way. Walt and Jesse drive out into the wilderness for a long cook, planning to make a large batch over several days while no one is watching. It is meant to be simple. They have their supplies, their equipment, their privacy. For a while, it even feels like a strange sort of camping trip. Two unlikely partners alone in the wide open country. But things go wrong, as they so often did for these two. The battery in the camper drains away. The vehicle will not start. And slowly, the men realize that they are stranded, miles from help, with no phone signal, no easy way out, and a dwindling supply of water in the punishing heat. As the days pass, Walt's body begins to fail him. He coughs, and the coughing brings up blood. To a man already living under the shadow of lung cancer, blood is the clearest possible sign that the disease is winning, that the end he has been waiting for has finally arrived. Out there in the dust and the heat, Walt becomes convinced that he is dying, and something quiet and resigned settles over him. He has done what he set out to do. He has begun building the money for his family. If this is where it ends, in a broken camper in the middle of nowhere, then at least there was a reason for it all. He makes a kind of peace with death. Then, through sheer stubborn cleverness, Walt finds a way to save them. He builds a makeshift battery out of spare parts and chemistry, enough to start the engine, and the two men limp back toward civilization, alive. He has cheated death one more time, this time by his own mind rather than by the doctor's. And on the way home, shaken by how close the end had felt, Walt does the responsible thing and arranges to see his doctor for an updated scan. He wants to know how much time he truly has left. What happens in that doctor's office should have been the happiest moment of his life. The scan comes back, and the news is wonderful. The cancer is in remission. The tumor that had been growing inside him has shrunk dramatically, by around 80%. A result so good that it opens up new possibilities. There is talk of surgery to remove what little remains. The death sentence has been lifted. The man who walked into that office, expecting to learn how many months he had left, walks out with the knowledge that he is, against all odds, going to live. His family is overjoyed. Gathered there to hear the news, they react the way any loving family would. There are tears and embraces and laughter, the pure relief of people who had been bracing themselves to lose someone they love, and have suddenly been told they get to keep him. The room fills with happiness. By every measure that should matter, Walter White is the luckiest man alive. He has been handed back the one thing that cancer steals from everyone it touches: a future. Even the frightening blood from the desert turns out to be harmless. When Walt admits that he had been coughing it up, the doctor explains that the cause was a small tear in his esophagus, the result of coughing so hard, along with some treatable inflammation. The blood that had convinced Walt he was dying in the desert had nothing to do with the cancer at all. Even his fear had been wrong. The doctor, kind but firm, gently scolds him for keeping his symptoms secret, for hiding something so important from the people trying to help him. Hiding things, of course, was what Walt did best. And in the middle of all that joy, something is wrong with Walt's face. While everyone around him celebrates, his expression does not match theirs. The relief that fills the room does not seem to reach him. He goes through the motions, accepts the hugs, says the right things, but a careful eye can see that the news has landed on him in a way no one else can understand. He should be lit up with gratitude. He is not. Some private storm is gathering behind his eyes, and he needs to be alone with it. So he excuses himself and walks to a restroom to gather himself. The scene that follows is one of the most important in the entire series, and it is almost completely silent. Walt washes his face in the sink, the way a person does when they are trying to steady themselves. He reaches for the paper towels to dry his hands, and as he does, he looks up and catches sight of his own reflection in the polished metal of the towel dispenser on the wall. He pauses. He stares at the blurry image of himself staring back. And then, with sudden and shocking violence, he drives his fist into it, again and again. He punches his own reflection until his knuckles are bruised and the metal is dented, until the calm and gentle man the world thinks it knows has, for a few seconds, completely disappeared. The good news had broken something loose in him, and what came out was rage. To understand why a man would react to being told he will live by attacking a wall, the whole shape of the story up to this point has to be held in mind. Everything Walt had done, every line he had crossed, every terrible act he had committed, had been built on a single foundation. He was a dying man. His time was short. Whatever monstrous things he did, he was doing them quickly, for his family, in the small window left before the cancer took him. The clock was the thing that made it all bearable. The clock was the excuse he handed to others and the comfort he gave himself. He could kill a man in a basement and still believe he was a decent person, because the killing served a clock that was already counting down to 0. The doctor had just stopped that clock. With the cancer in remission, the foundation underneath everything Walt had built simply dissolved. He was no longer a dying man racing to provide before the end. He was a healthy man, in his 50s, deep in a violent criminal world, surrounded by people who would kill him without a second thought, and there was no deadline anymore. There was no end built into the plan. The story he had told himself, the comforting tale of a doomed father doing what he had to do in his final days, no longer made any sense. He had every reason in the world to stop now. The cancer was retreating. He could have surgery and live. He could take whatever money he had already made, hand it to his family, and walk away from the whole nightmare while he still could. And the thought of that, the thought of stopping and going back, filled him with something close to despair. This is the hinge on which the entire question turns. The whole mystery of why Walter White could never stop comes down, in large part, to this single silent scene in a restroom. Before this moment, his refusal to quit could be explained away. He was dying. He was afraid for his family. He was running out of time. After this moment, none of those explanations hold. The cancer was no longer killing him. The clock had stopped. The deadline was gone. He had reasons to stop, and no honest reason left to continue. A man who was truly only in it for his family, only racing against death, would have wept with relief in that office and started planning his exit. Walt punched a wall until his hand bled. That reaction tells the truth that Walt himself could not yet say out loud. He did not want the clock to stop. He did not want to be saved. Somewhere inside him, the news that he would live was not good news at all, because living meant the end of the only life that had ever made him feel like someone. The cancer, strangely, had been a gift to him. It had given him permission to do the thing he secretly wanted to do, to step out of his small, invisible existence and become powerful and feared and brilliant, all while telling himself it was for his family and only for a little while. Remission took that permission away. It threatened to send him back to the classroom, back to the car wash, back to being the man who dried strangers' tires and was forgotten the moment they drove off. Consider the number he had set for himself. $737,000, the exact amount he had calculated his family would need. That number was supposed to be the finish line, the point at which a sensible, family-driven man would stop. And here, in this office, was the perfect moment to honor it. He was going to live. He could provide what he could provide and end the whole thing. If the number had ever truly been the goal, remission was the gift that let him reach for the door. Instead of reaching for the door, he smashed his reflection. The number was never really the point. The life behind the number was the point, and he could not bear to give it up. There is a small detail from behind the scenes that quietly underlines how important this moment was meant to be. The punch was so forceful that the actor playing Walt could not safely strike the real metal fixture, because doing so would have shattered the bones in his hand. So a fake dispenser had to be built especially for the shot. The people making the show understood that this small, silent scene carried enormous weight, that this fist against this wall was one of the most revealing things their character would ever do. And they built it with care, so that the violence of it would land exactly as intended. And then there is the reflection itself, which ties this moment back to the very beginning of the story. Walt did not lash out at the doctor or the scan or the disease. He lashed out at the image of his own face. In that dim metal, he saw himself. And the self he saw was the one he hated most. The washed-up genius, the man who had sold his future for $5,000. The small and overlooked figure he had been for 20 long years. Remission meant going back to being that man. It meant returning to the reflection in the metal, and rather than return to it, Walt drove his fist into the image until it twisted and broke, as if he could beat the small man out of existence with his own hands. From that bloodied moment forward, a new kind of man was walking through the story. The dying husband racing the clock for his family was gone, replaced by something colder and hungrier. A healthy man who had decided, without ever saying the words, that he was not going back to his old life, no matter what it cost. He had reasons to stop, and he ignored every one of them. He had a clear door to walk through, and he turned away from it. The excuse had vanished, and the truth had stepped into its place. A man like that needs more than an excuse. He needs an identity. If Walter White, the teacher, belonged to the small life he refused to return to, then a new person would have to carry him into the dangerous new world he had chosen to stay in. He would need a name that frightened people. He would need a face that felt nothing. He would need to become someone who never had to look at that weak reflection again. And so, piece by piece, he began to build him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the news that should have saved him became the moment that doomed everyone around him. Because once the dying man was gone, Walt kept going with no honest reason left but his own hunger. He smashed the reflection of the small man he refused to become again. Next comes the hat, the name, and the birth of the cold and fearless figure who would let him bury that small man for good. Section 5. The birth of Heisenberg. A name is a small thing on the surface. It is only a word, a few sounds, something written at the top of a form. But a name can also be a door. The right name, spoken at the right moment, can let a person step out of the life they have always lived and into one they have only imagined. For most of his years, Walter White had been exactly the kind of name that nobody remembers. A soft and forgettable label for a soft and forgettable man. The story of how he stopped being that man, and how he could never stop afterward, runs straight through the moment he gave himself a different name entirely. By the time the cancer went into remission, something inside Walt had quietly settled into place. He had decided, in the silence of that restroom, that he was not going back. He was not going to return to the classroom and the car wash and the long gray years of being overlooked. The dying man who could excuse his crimes by pointing at a clock was gone. What stood in his place was a healthy man with a secret hunger and no good reason to feed it. And a man like that, if he wants to survive in a world of killers, cannot do it as a timid teacher who flinches at raised voices. He needs to become someone else. The world he had chosen made the need urgent. Walt and Jesse could cook a product purer and stronger than anything else on the street. But talent alone did not keep them safe. They were small fish in dangerous water, pushed around, cheated, and threatened by men far more violent than they were. One of those men was a drug boss named Tuco, a brutal and unpredictable figure who took their product, beat people half to death on a whim, and respected nothing but force. As long as Walt remained the gentle teacher, men like Tuco would always have the upper hand. To rise, to be safe, to be taken seriously, Walt would have to make himself frightening. He would have to become the kind of man that even violent people thought twice about crossing. So he built that man, piece by piece, starting with the way he looked. The chemotherapy had already cost Walt his hair, and rather than hide it or mourn it, he leaned into it. He shaved his head completely, leaving it smooth and bare. He grew a hard little goatee that framed his mouth and changed the whole shape of his face. He put on dark glasses that hid his eyes. And then there was the hat. A flat-topped black hat, the kind a person might once have seen on an old-fashioned gentleman, sat on his bald head and pulled the whole look together. On anyone else it might have seemed ordinary. On Walt it became something else, a kind of crown for the new self he was assembling. When the hat went on, the mild teacher receded, and someone colder and harder stepped forward to take his place. And that someone had a name. Walt called himself Heisenberg. It was not a name he picked at random. Heisenberg was the name of one of the most famous scientists who ever lived, a towering figure in the world of physics, a man whose ideas changed how human beings understand reality itself. For a chemistry teacher who had spent 20 years convinced that he had been cheated out of his own greatness, the choice was loaded with meaning. By naming himself after a giant of science, Walt was claiming, in secret, the stature he felt the world had denied him. The small man who dried strangers' cars was now borrowing the name of a legend and wearing it like armor. There is a deeper layer to the choice that many who study the show have pointed to, though it lives in the realm of interpretation rather than anything the series spells out. The real Heisenberg is most famous for an idea about uncertainty, the notion that there are things about the tiniest pieces of the universe that can never be pinned down exactly, that some truths slip away the moment a person tries to measure them. A man who wished to be unknowable, uncatchable, impossible to fully grasp, could hardly have found a more fitting name. Whether Walt intended all of that meaning or simply liked the sound of it, the name suited him perfectly. He was becoming a man who wanted to operate in the shadows, seen but never truly known, present everywhere and pinned down nowhere. The new man was born in full during a single unforgettable confrontation. Walt, freshly shaved and wearing the hat, walked straight into the lair of Tuco, the violent boss who had been cheating and threatening them. It was an act of stunning nerve. This was a place where people got hurt, run by a man who could explode into savage violence without warning. The old Walter White would never have set foot inside. But the man who walked in that day was not behaving like the old Walter White. He was calm. He was cold. He demanded money, a large sum, payment for product that Tuco had taken and for the trouble he had caused. The boss, amused and dangerous, asked the stranger who he thought he was. And Walt told him. He said his name was Heisenberg. Then he did something that turned a bluff into a legend.
He pulled out what looked like a chunk of their blue product, a crystal of the drug, and he threw it hard against the floor. It was not the drug at all. It was an explosive that Walt had made with his own chemistry, a substance that looked harmless but detonated on impact. The blast tore through the room, shattering the windows, filling the air with smoke and noise, sending Tuco's men reeling. And through it all, Walt stood there, unharmed and unmoved, holding more of the same explosive in his hand as a promise that he could do it again. In the space of a few seconds, the timid teacher had shown a room full of killers that he was not someone to be touched. He had walked in as a victim and walked out as a force. For the first time in his entire life, Walter White was not the one who was afraid. He was the one who made others afraid. It is impossible to overstate what that feeling did to him. Back in the early days, when Jesse had asked him why he was risking everything, Walt had admitted that the work made him feel awake, made him feel alive. Heisenberg was that feeling turned into a person. The persona fed the starving hunger that had been gnawing at Walt since the day he sold his future for $5,000. As Heisenberg, he was finally the powerful and brilliant figure he had always believed himself to be. He was respected through fear. He was the smartest and most dangerous man in the room. The small, invisible teacher had been buried beneath the hat, and standing on top of that grave was someone who would never be overlooked again. The mask served another purpose too, one that was quieter and more troubling. It gave Walt a way to do terrible things while protecting the image he held of himself. He could tell himself that the gentle husband and father was still in there somewhere, that it was Heisenberg, the other man, who threatened and schemed and hurt people. The persona worked like a shield against his own conscience.
When the worst came, he could hold the worst at arm's length and pretend it belonged to someone else. The hat let him keep believing he was a good man wearing a costume, rather than a dangerous man who had simply stopped pretending. But a mask worn often enough stops being a mask. Over the seasons that followed, the hat came out whenever Walt needed to be cold and ruthless, and slowly, the gentle teacher appeared less and less. The seam between Walter and Heisenberg grew thinner and harder to find. The voice he used as Heisenberg crept into his ordinary conversations. The flashes of cruelty stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like the truth. The man underneath the hat and the man on top of it were folding into one. By the later stretches of the story, it became almost impossible to say where Walter White ended and Heisenberg began, because there was no longer much daylight between them.
The disguise had grown into the face.
This is where the persona connects directly to the question at the heart of everything. Why could Walter White never stop? A large part of the answer lives in the hat. Stopping would have meant taking it off for good. It would have meant setting down the name, walking away from the power and the fear and the feeling of mattering, and becoming, once again, the small man in the metal reflection. Heisenberg was the part of Walt that never had to go back to that life, and so Walt clung to him with everything he had. Every time a sensible exit appeared, every time he could have walked away with money in hand and his family intact, it was Heisenberg who refused. The persona was not only a disguise, it was the home where the hunger lived, and the hunger did not want to die. The image of that man, bald and bearded beneath the dark hat, became one of the most recognizable pictures in the whole history of television. People who had never seen a single full episode could recognize the silhouette. The hat alone came to stand for the entire idea of the dangerous self hiding inside the ordinary man. The menace that can grow inside someone who decides he deserves more than the life he was given. It became a kind of shorthand for power bought at a terrible price. And it all began with a frightened teacher who decided, after the cancer let him live, that he would rather be feared than be forgotten. Still, a name and a hat are only armor, and armor can be put on and taken off. The real question was whether the man underneath had truly changed, or whether the hat was just a costume he could shed when he came home to his family. The answer would come not in a drug den or a desert, but in his own house, in the middle of an ordinary argument, when his frightened wife looked at him and begged him to admit that he was in danger. And in that moment, with no hat on his head and no killers in the room, Walter White would finally say out loud exactly who he believed he had become. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a frightened teacher built a fearless stranger, gave him a great man's name and a dark hat, and slowly let that stranger grow into his own face. The mask became the man, and the man no longer wished to take it off. Next comes the night his wife begged him to admit he was in danger, and the cold answer that revealed how far the pride had taken him. Section 6. I am the one who knocks. The most dangerous words a person ever says are not spoken in dark alleys or hidden labs. They are spoken at home, in the kitchen, in the middle of an ordinary argument, to the people who know them best. There is no hat to hide behind in a marriage. There is no costume. When a husband and wife stand across from each other in their own house and finally say the things they have been circling for months, whatever comes out is the truth, or at least the truth as one of them believes it. The night Walter White told his wife who he really was, he was not wearing the dark hat or the cold disguise. He was just a man in his own home, and what he said could never be taken back. By this point in the story, Walt had climbed higher than he ever expected. He was no longer cooking in a battered camper out in the desert. He worked now in a hidden, spotless professional laboratory, built underground, run by a careful and powerful man named Gus Fring. Gus ran a vast operation behind the front of an ordinary fast food business, and he was everything Walt was not in the criminal world. Calm, patient, organized, and utterly ruthless beneath a friendly smile. Working for Gus brought Walt more money than he had ever imagined, sums far beyond the modest number he had once calculated for his family. On the surface, he had arrived. But beneath the surface, Walt's situation was far more fragile than it looked. Gus did not trust him. Gus valued his skill, but watched him constantly. kept him on a tight leash, and made it clear in 100 small ways that Walt was a tool to be used rather than a partner to be respected. Worse, Gus had begun to favor Jesse, drawing the younger man closer and pushing Walt to the side, working quietly to make the brilliant chemist replaceable. Walt could feel his control slipping. He could feel himself being managed, contained, and slowly cut out. For a man whose whole sense of self depended on being the most important person in the room, this was a kind of slow poison. Around the same time, violence had crept closer to Walt's home in a way his wife could feel, even if she could not fully understand it. A gentle and gifted young chemist named Gale, who had worked in that same underground lab, had been killed. Gale's death was tied to the deadly games being played between Walt, Gus, and Jesse, a desperate move to keep Walt himself alive and useful. Skylar did not know the details, but she was not foolish, and she could sense that the people her husband was tangled up with were the kind who left bodies behind. The fear that had been building in her for a long time finally broke open. So Skylar did what a frightened wife who loves her family does. She begged her husband to face the truth. She pleaded with him to stop pretending that everything was under control. She wanted him to admit that he was in danger, that they all might be in danger, and to do something about it before it was too late. She raised the idea of going to the authorities, of seeking protection, of finding some way out of the nightmare. And to make him understand how real the threat felt to her, she painted a terrible picture. She imagined a day when an in-over-his-head Walter would open his own front door and be shot in the face by someone he had crossed. She was not trying to wound him. She was trying to save him, and to save their children, by forcing him to see himself as the small and vulnerable man she believed he still was underneath it all. What she got in return was not comfort. It was not reassurance. It was pride, raw and cold and a little bit frightening. Walt did not soften. He did not take her hand and promise to find a way out. Instead, something in him rose up, insulted, almost offended that she could picture him as a victim. He asked her who she thought she was talking to. He asked her who she imagined she saw when she looked at him. And then he told her, in plain and chilling words, exactly how he saw himself. He told her he made more money than she would ever believe, more than she could imagine even if he tried to explain it. He told her that the operation he was part of was so large that it could be listed among the great businesses of the country, and that it would collapse and vanish without him, that it simply ceased to exist if he were not there to run it. He brushed aside her vision of him as a man who gets shot at his own door. He told her she did not understand him at all. And then he gave her the line that would echo through the rest of the story. He was not in danger, he said. He was the danger. The man who opens his door and gets shot was not him. He was the one who knocks. In that single speech, the whole foundation of Walt's story turned completely upside down. Think back to where it all began. At the start, the family was the reason. Walt did dangerous things in order to protect and provide for the people he loved, and his fear for them was the engine of everything. Now, standing in his own kitchen, the family was begging him to stop, and he refused them in the name of his own greatness. The protector had become the threat. The man who had once wrapped every crime in the language of love for his wife and children had just told his terrified wife that being feared and important mattered more to him than her peace of mind. She offered him the family story, the chance to be the careful father again, to step back and keep them safe. He threw it away because accepting it meant admitting he was small. That is the heart of why this scene matters so much. The family had stopped being the reason to keep going. The family had become the thing standing in the way of his pride. And his pride won. The mask he had built, the cold and powerful Heisenberg, was no longer something he put on for drug dealers and took off at home. It had soaked all the way through him. The man who said those words to Skylar was not playing a part. He believed them. He had come to see himself, truly and completely, as the most important and most dangerous man in any room he entered. And yet there is a deep and bitter irony hidden inside that speech, one that the show built on purpose. The episode that holds this moment is called Cornered, and that title is a quiet joke at Walt's expense. At the very instant he declares himself untouchable, the one who knocks, the man without whom an empire would crumble, Walt is actually more cornered than he has ever been. His boss is calmly planning to have him replaced and quite possibly killed. His partner's loyalty is being turned against him. He is watched, managed, and boxed in on every side. The grand claim that the whole business would collapse without him was not even true at that moment, because Gus was already grooming someone to take his place. This points to a reading that many who study the show have offered, and it rings true. The bigger Walt's boast, the smaller he secretly felt. The speech was partly the bluster of a frightened and cornered man, puffing himself up to feel large. A truly powerful man does not usually need to announce his power to his own wife in his own kitchen. The fact that Walt needed to say it so loudly, needed to claim so much, suggests how shaky the ground beneath him really was. The wound from Section 1 had never healed. The terror of being small, of being overlooked, of being the lesser man, was still driving him. And the louder he proclaimed his greatness, the more clearly that old fear showed through. The cost of those words landed at once. Skylar was so shaken by what she had glimpsed in her husband that she could not stay in the house with him. She gathered their baby daughter and left, driving away to think, going so far as to point her car toward another state, weighing whether to run from him entirely. In the end, she turned back, trapped by circumstances and by her own tangled choices. But the meaning of that drive was clear. Walt's declaration of power had not made his family feel safe. It had made his own wife flee from him with their child in the car. The thing he claimed to be protecting recoiled from the man he had become. The same hunger was bleeding into every corner of his home life around this time, in smaller and quieter ways. In that same stretch of the story, Walt bought back the car wash where he had once been humiliated, and he made a point of forcing its former owner to leave behind the framed first dollar the man had earned. A petty little act of dominance over someone who had once looked down on him. He bought his teenage son a flashy and expensive sports car, showing off, playing the big man, asserting himself as the powerful provider. None of these things were about his family's needs. They were about Walt's need to feel large, to settle old scores, to never again be the man who dried strangers' cars and was forgotten. The drive to matter had spilled out of the drug world and into his living room, touching everyone around him. All of which brings the story back, once more, to the question underneath everything. Why could Walter White never stop? The kitchen speech gives one of the clearest answers in the whole series. By now, his entire identity rested on being the one who knocks. To stop would be to admit that he was, after all, the man who gets shot at the door. The vulnerable and ordinary person his wife saw when she looked at him. Quitting would mean killing Heisenberg and bringing the small teacher back to life. And Walt would rather risk his money, his freedom, and even his family than do that. His pride had become the load-bearing wall of his whole sense of self, and a man cannot tear down the wall that holds up his entire house. Still, all of this remained, in a sense, just words. It is easy for a man to claim he is in it for power and empire when no one ever puts that claim to a real test. Anyone can boast about greatness in the heat of an argument. The true measure of what Walt was chasing would come later, when his own partners walked up to him and offered him a clean and enormous fortune, simply to step away. No danger, no strings. Far more money than he had ever set out to earn. All he had to do was take it and stop. What Walter White did when that offer was placed in front of him would settle the question of his soul for good. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So in his own kitchen, with no hat and no disguise, Walt told his frightened wife that his pride mattered more than her peace, and watched her flee with their child rather than feel safe beside him. The protector had become the threat. Next comes the moment his partners offered him millions to simply walk away, and the 4 words he gave them instead that explained everything. Section 7. The Empire Business. There is a question that sits quietly underneath every life spent chasing money. How much is enough? Most people never have to answer it honestly, because most people never get close enough to find out. They keep working and saving and wanting, and the question stays safely in the distance. But every so often, life walks straight up to a person, sets a fortune on the table, and asks them plainly whether they are ready to stop. The moment that fortune appears, the truth comes out. Because the way a person answers the question of enough reveals what they were really after all along. For Walter White, that moment came in the form of a simple business offer, and his answer settled once and for all the mystery of what was driving him. By this stage of the story, Walt had finally gotten everything he had ever told himself he wanted. His powerful and dangerous boss, Gus Fring, was dead, killed in a scheme Walt himself had set in motion. With Gus gone, Walt was no longer working for anyone. He was the boss now, running his own operation alongside his old partner Jesse and a careful, experienced criminal named Mike. The brilliant chemist who had once been pushed around and managed and sidelined was at last sitting at the top of his own enterprise. The thing he had reached for through years of risk and bloodshed was finally his. He was in charge. But the operation had recently crossed a line so dark that it shook even the hardened men around him. A robbery they carried out, a theft of chemicals from a moving train, had been witnessed by a young boy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rather than let the child go, one of their newer associates shot and killed him. It was a cold and senseless murder of an innocent, and it sat heavily on the whole group. For Jesse, who still had a conscience buried under everything he had done, it was unbearable. For Mike, who had seen a great deal of ugliness in his life, it was a sign that this particular operation had become more trouble than it was worth. The 2 of them had reached their limit. They wanted out, and they had found a clean way to get there. A buyer had appeared, a man willing to purchase their share of the stolen chemicals for an enormous sum. If Mike and Jesse sold their portions, each of them would walk away with around $5 million. But the deal had one condition. The buyer wanted all of the chemicals, which meant he needed Walt's share too. So Mike and Jesse came to Walt with the offer. Sell your third, take your $5 million, and leave with us. Walk away rich, walk away alive, walk away free. To understand how staggering this offer was, the story has to reach all the way back to the number Walt had once calculated. $737,000. That was the figure he had worked out as the amount his family would need. the goal that was supposed to let him stop. $5 million was nearly 7 times that amount. It was a fortune beyond anything he had set out to earn. Enough to secure his family for generations, with no danger attached and no strings to pull. It was, in every practical sense, the perfect ending. The clean exit. The door held wide open. Everything Walt had ever claimed to want was sitting right there for the taking. Mike, watching Walt hesitate, said something that cut straight to the bone. He told Walt that he had never in his life seen anybody work so hard to avoid getting $5 million. Because Walt would not take it. He refused. And Jesse, baffled, could not understand why. To Jesse, the math was simple. It was more money than he had ever dreamed of, a way out of a life that was eating him alive, handed to him for free. Why on earth would anyone say no? So Walt tried to explain himself, and in doing so, he said the truest thing he had ever said about who he was. He told Jesse that he was not in the meth business. He told him he was not in the money business either. He told him, in a few plain and quiet words, that he was in the empire business. Jesse, with the simple decency that still lived inside him, asked the obvious question. Was a meth empire really something to be proud of? Walt did not answer that question directly. He could not, because the honest answer would have exposed too much. Instead, he told a story. He told Jesse about a company he had helped to found long ago, back in his school days. A company he had even named himself. It had started small, just a few young men with big dreams and a handful of ideas. And for reasons he would only call personal, he had walked away from it and sold his share for a tiny sum. That company, he told Jesse, was now worth billions. He still checked its worth, watching the number climb. He had walked away once from something that became one of the great success stories of its field, and he had spent the rest of his life regretting it. In that moment, the wound from the very beginning of the whole story reached all the way forward and wrapped its hands around the present. Everything connected. The $5,000. The billions. The bitterness Walt had carried for 20 silent years. The habit of tracking a company he no longer owned. It all came pouring into this single decision. Walt was not refusing $5 million because he was greedy for more money. He was refusing it because the money had never been the point. He was chasing the empire he believed had been stolen from him, the greatness he was certain he deserved, the second chance at the life he had thrown away when he was young and proud and afraid. The drug operation was his new gray matter. It was his shot at finally building the enormous, powerful, world-shaking thing he had once let slip through his fingers. And he would sooner die than sell it off cheap a second time. He told Jesse that selling now would be repeating the worst mistake of his life, walking away from something destined to become huge. He had done that once. He would not do it again. The lesson he had taken from gray matter was not that pride is dangerous or that bitterness poisons a life. The lesson he had taken was that he should never, ever let go of something that might make him great. That same stretch of the story drove the point home in the cruelest way. Walt insisted that Jesse stay for dinner at his house, and what followed was one of the most painfully awkward meals in the whole series. Skylar sat at the table cold and hollow, barely speaking, broken by everything she had learned about her husband, taking small, bitter jabs at him in front of his partner. The warmth of a family meal was completely gone, replaced by a frozen silence between two people who could no longer stand each other. After Jesse witnessed all of it, Walt admitted the truth out loud. Skylar had taken their children out of the house to protect them from him. She was no longer his partner or his love. She was simply waiting, he said, for his cancer to come back and finish him off. And the business, the empire, was the only thing he had left. That admission tied the whole story into a knot. Remember how it started. The family was the reason. Walt did everything, or so he claimed, to provide for and protect the people he loved. Now look at where he stood. His wife despised him. His children had been taken away. The family he had supposedly been building this empire to save had recoiled from him completely and fled. The reason was gone. The justification had crumbled into dust. There was nothing left to protect. And he kept going anyway. He clung to the empire harder than ever, precisely because the family was gone, and the empire was all that remained of his sense of himself. The cover story had fully fallen away, leaving only the naked truth underneath. Walter White was not doing this for anyone but himself. With nothing left to protect, with $5 million clean dollars offered and refused, with his marriage in ruins and his children removed for their own safety, he chose the empire over all of it. The man who once said it was all for his family now had no family in his home and an empire he would not surrender for any price. The desperation of his refusal showed how deep it ran. That same night, Walt crept out to steal the chemicals so the sale could not go through without him. Mike, who knew Walt better than Walt liked, had anticipated exactly this and was waiting for him. Mike caught him, restrained him, and came close to killing him on the spot. Only a quick plan offered up by Jesse, a way for all three men to get their money, saved Walt's life. Even cornered, even caught, even with a gun aimed his way, Walt would rather have risked death than allow his empire to be carved up and sold off. That is not the behavior of a man chasing a comfortable retirement. That is the behavior of a man who has fused his entire soul to a thing and cannot imagine living without it. So here, in this offer and this refusal, lies the clearest answer the whole story ever gives to the question of why Walter White could never stop. Stopping was never truly about money, because he turned down a fortune. It was never truly about the family, because the family was already gone, and he kept going. It was about the empire, the greatness, the desperate second chance at the life he had abandoned for $5,000 when he was a young man too proud to feel small. He told everyone the answer himself, in a quiet kitchen, in a handful of plain words. He was in the empire business. Everything else had been a story he told to make the truth easier to live with. But an empire is never built alone, and it is never built without cost. The people around Walt could see what he could not, and again they tried to show him the door. The $5 million offer was only one of many exits he turned away from. There were others, some gentle and some furious, some offered by friends and some shouted by dying men. Gathered together, all of those refused chances tell their own story, and one of them came from a man who, with his last breaths of patience, told Walter White exactly what his pride had cost them all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So when life set a clean fortune in front of him and asked if he had enough, Walt answered that he was in the empire business, and chose that empire even after his family had already slipped away. The cover story was gone. Next comes a closer look at every door he refused to walk through, and the furious final warning of a man who had finally had enough of Walt's pride. Section 8. Every exit he refused. A person is not judged only by the trap they fall into. Anyone can stumble into trouble through bad luck or a single poor choice. The deeper measure of a person is what they do once they see the way out. A trapped man who claws toward the first open door is one kind of person. A man who stands in front of an open door again and again and chooses to turn back into the burning house is another kind entirely. To understand why Walter White could never stop, it helps to stop looking at the things that pushed him forward and start counting the doors he refused to walk through. Because the doors were there. They were always there. And he walked past every single one. The very first door appeared before the worst of the crimes had even begun. Back near the start of his illness, his old friend and former partner Elliot, along with Gretchen, offered to pay for his cancer treatment. They offered him a job at their thriving company. It was a clean, legal, generous rescue, a way to save his family from financial ruin without breaking a single law, without hurting a single person. All Walt had to do was accept the help. He said no. He refused, because taking that help meant admitting he needed it, meant standing as the lesser man in front of the people he envied most. The first exit out of the whole nightmare appeared early and stood wide open, and Walt slammed it shut to protect his pride. Another door was the one made of money, the one Walt himself had built. He had calculated his goal down to the dollar, 737,000 of them, and promised himself he would stop once he reached it. He reached it. Then he sailed far past it. In one quietly devastating scene, his wife led him to a storage space and showed him what all his work had actually produced. There, stacked on the floor, was a mountain of cash so enormous that she had given up trying to count it. She had tried to weigh it instead because counting was hopeless. And standing in front of that impossible pile of money, she asked him a simple and exhausted question. How much was enough? How big did the pile have to get before he would stop? Walt had no real answer for her. He had long ago blown past any sensible target. The door marked enough stood open in front of a literal heap of his own success, and he could not bring himself to step through it. There was the family door, the one his wife held open in their kitchen when she begged him to stop pretending and go to the authorities, to find a way out before the violence reached their children. He refused that one too, with cold pride, and watched her flee the house with their baby rather than feel safe beside him. And there was the largest door of all, the $5 million offer from his own partners, the clean fortune with no danger attached, which he turned away in the name of the empire business. These were not faint hints or hard-to-see opportunities. They were enormous, obvious, repeated chances to walk away with money and safety and his family more or less intact. A man held prisoner by circumstance takes the first real exit he can find. Walt was offered exit after exit after exit, and he refused each one. The thing keeping him in that life was carried inside him, in the hunger that demanded he be great and the terror of ever being small again. No villain locked the door. No circumstance nailed it shut. His own pride did that, every time, with his own hand. One man saw all of this clearly and told Walt the truth straight to his face. That man was Mike. Mike was the careful, experienced professional, the one who had survived in the criminal world for decades precisely because he kept his head down and his ego in check. He had watched Walt take a perfect arrangement and blow it apart out of nothing more than wounded vanity. And one day, his patience finally gone, Mike unloaded on him. He told Walt that they had once had a good thing, a beautiful thing. They had a steady operation, a safe lab, a reliable system, everything they could possibly need. And it had all run smoothly, like clockwork. Walt could have kept quiet, done his work, and made as much money as any man could ever want. It had been perfect, and Walt had ruined it. He had blown the whole thing up, Mike said, because of his pride and his ego, because he always had to be the man, because he could never simply do his job and know his place. If Walt had only stayed in his lane, Mike told him, they would all have been fine. It was the clearest diagnosis anyone in the whole story ever offered. Mike named the disease that Walt himself would never say aloud. The problem was not the cancer, or the money, or the family, or bad luck. The problem was pride. The problem was ego. The problem was a man who could not stand to be anything less than the most important person in the room, even when being important got everyone around him killed. And then, in the cruelest possible illustration of Mike's point, Walt killed Mike. It happened soon after. Mike was finished. He was done with all of it, driving away to disappear into a quiet retirement, leaving the whole bloody business behind. He wanted nothing more from Walt than to be left alone. But Walt needed something from him, a list of names, and when Mike refused and threw a few stinging insults along with the refusal, something in Walt's wounded pride snapped. He shot Mike. He killed the one man who had told him the truth, the one man who had tried to teach him restraint. And he did it in a flash of injured ego over an argument that did not need to end in blood. And almost the instant it was done, Walt realized how pointless it had been. He could have gotten those names another way. He had not needed to kill Mike at all. He had murdered a man who was already walking out of his life, for an insult, for nothing, because his pride could not absorb the wound. Mike's death was the perfect, terrible proof of everything Mike had just accused him of. But the coldest example of what Walt would sacrifice to keep his grip had come much earlier, and it was quieter and more haunting than any shooting. It involved a young woman named Jane. Jane was Jesse's girlfriend, a troubled young woman fighting old addictions, and she had become a problem for Walt. She knew too much. She was pulling Jesse away from Walt's control, and she had even pushed to get Jesse the money Walt was holding over him, threatening the careful hold Walt kept on his partner. One night, Walt let himself into Jesse's apartment and found the two of them unconscious, having used drugs together, lying still in the dark. As Walt stood there, Jane, lying on her back while she slept, began to choke. She was in real danger, and saving her would have taken almost nothing. A single small movement, simply turning her onto her side. Walt started to move toward her, and then he stopped himself. He stood there in the dim room and watched her die, choosing not to do the one easy thing that would have saved her life. He wept as it happened. He was not unmoved, but he made the choice anyway, because her death solved his problem. It removed the threat she posed, and it tightened his control over Jesse rather than loosening it. A man who would let a young woman die, who would override his own instinct to help and simply watch, all to keep his hold on his partner, is a man who has shown exactly how far he will go to avoid losing his grip on anything. The same hunger that refused the open doors also refused to let go of the people it had hooked. Both came from the same place inside him. And there was one more door, the strangest and most fitting of all. After everything, Walt's cancer came back. The disease that had once handed him a deadline returned, offering him the very same natural ending it had promised at the start. The dying man excuse came circling back around. He could have used it. He could have taken his money, made his peace, and let the illness carry him out of the story the way he had once imagined it would. Even his own approaching death held a door open for him. And still, he did not stop.
Even the return of the thing that had started it all could not pull him free, because by now, stopping had become more frightening to him than dying. So every refused exit points to the same answer. The answer this whole story keeps arriving at from new directions. Walter White could never stop because nothing outside him was ever truly holding him there. The world kept offering him the way out. His wife offered it. His old friends offered it. His partners offered it. His own body twice offered it. And every time, the hunger inside him, the wound that demanded greatness and dreaded smallness, reached out and shut the door. Mike named it with his last shreds of patience. Jane paid for it with her life. The mountain of money proved it. The pattern is too consistent to mean anything else. The prison was built inside the man, and he held the only key, and he would never, ever turn it. A man can keep slamming doors for a long time, but every door he shuts traps a little more smoke in the house. And the prices of all those refusals had been quietly piling up in the background through the entire story. The bill was coming due. The next chapter counts the full and terrible cost of never stopping. Everything and everyone that was consumed because one proud man could not bring himself to walk away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So Walt was never truly trapped by the world, because the world kept holding doors open, and his pride shut every one, costing Mike his life and Jane hers along the way. The prison was built inside him. Next comes the full price of all that refusal, the people, the fortune, and the family slowly swallowed by a man who would not stop. Section 9. The Wreckage. A fire built to keep one man warm can burn down the whole house if he refuses to put it out. For a long stretch of the story, it was easy to forget that. Walt kept winning. The money kept growing. The threats kept getting eliminated. Each season seemed to end with him a little more powerful, a little more untouchable, a little closer to the empire he dreamed of. But every door he had refused to walk through carried a price. And prices do not disappear simply because they go unpaid for a while. They gather quietly in the dark. And then one day, they all come due at once. Near the end of the story, the bill for everything Walter White had done arrived in full. And what it consumed was almost everything and almost everyone he had ever touched. The truest measure of that cost begins with one of the coldest things he ever did. An act so calculated that it is hard to look at directly. During his secret war with his boss, Gus, Walt needed to turn Jesse against the man and pull his partner back under his own control. To do it, he chose a child. The young son of Jesse's girlfriend was poisoned with berries from a plant, made gravely ill in a way that pointed the blame elsewhere, all so that Jesse would believe Gus had done it and join Walt in destroying him. The boy nearly died, and the plan worked exactly as Walt intended. The final, quiet image of that chapter of the story was the very plant, sitting harmless and green in a pot in Walt's own backyard, confirming what almost no viewer wanted to believe. He had been willing to poison a child to manipulate his friend and win his war. The cost of that act was paid first by a sick little boy, and second by whatever remained of Walt's own soul. The man he poisoned that child to keep was Jesse, and the slow destruction of Jesse was a cost all its own. Their partnership had once been the closest thing to a real bond in Walt's life, something that looked, at its best moments, almost like a father and a son. They argued and fought and saved each other more times than either could count.
But across the seasons, Walt used Jesse again and again. He lied to him, manipulated him, played on his guilt and his loyalty, and bent the younger man's life around his own needs. The betrayals piled up until there was almost nothing left of the trust between them. And at the lowest point of the whole story, Walt delivered the cruelest blow he had. He told Jesse, to his face, that he had stood and watched Jane die and done nothing to save her. He said it to wound, to break the last thing in Jesse that still cared. Soon after, in the desert, Walt handed Jesse over to a gang of killers who chained him up and forced him to cook for them. The bond Walt had once seemed to value above almost anything became simply another thing he destroyed on his way down. Then there was Hank. Hank was Walt's brother-in-law, a loud and proud agent who had spent years hunting the mysterious figure called Heisenberg, without ever once suspecting that the man he was chasing sat across from him at family dinners. The truth came to Hank slowly and then all at once, sparked by a small clue left in a book. And once he knew, he could not unknow it. The long-hidden war between the hunter and his prey finally broke into the open and led them both out to the empty desert. There, at last, Hank got what he had worked years to achieve. He arrested Walt. For one brief moment, the law had won, and the story seemed about to end. But Walt's own world reached out and ruined even that. The gang of killers Walt had become entangled with arrived at the scene, and a gunfight erupted across the desert sand. When the shooting stopped, Hank was wounded and captured by the gang. And then came the most desperate moment of Walter White's entire life. He begged. He pleaded with the gang's leader to spare Hank's life, offering everything he had, his entire fortune of $80 million, every cent he had bled and lied and killed to build, in exchange for the life of his brother-in-law. It was the one moment when all of Walt's money meant nothing, because the man holding the gun simply shot Hank anyway. Walt collapsed into the dirt, utterly destroyed, watching the empire he had built murder a member of his own family right in front of him. The danger he had insisted he was, back in that kitchen, had finally circled around and killed someone he loved. The money went next. With Hank dead in the sand, the gang loaded most of Walt's $80 million into their trucks and drove away, leaving him with only a small fraction of it. The fortune he had refused $5 million to protect, the treasure he had let a child be poisoned and a woman die and a family be torn apart to build, vanished in a single afternoon. The great pile of cash that his wife could not even count was gone. Walt was left alone in the desert, rolling a single barrel of money across the empty ground. A king with the ruins of his treasure and no kingdom left to spend it in. At home, the last pieces fell. The truth finally reached his family in full. His teenage son, who had once idolized him, learned what his father truly was and turned against him completely, stepping between Walt and his mother, calling the police on his own father. There was a terrible and frightening struggle in the house. Walt fled, and in his panic, he even took his baby daughter with him for a time before bringing her back. In a last, twisted attempt to protect his wife from suspicion, he made a phone call pretending to be a cruel monster threatening her, performing the villain so that the authorities listening in would believe she had been his victim rather than his partner. The family he had sworn he was doing everything to protect now saw him exactly as Skylar had once feared, as the danger itself. They did not want his money. They did not want him. They wanted him gone. And gone he went. Walter White became a hunted fugitive, smuggled far away to a cold and lonely cabin in the frozen north, cut off from everyone, His cancer returned and slowly killing him at last. He sat alone with barrels of money he could not spend, and no one in the world willing to take it. When he tried to send some of it to his son, the boy rejected it with fury. His old friends from his gray matter days went on television and publicly cut every tie to him, treating the mere mention of his name as something shameful. The great man, the one who knocks, the man in the empire business, ended his story alone in the cold, dying, with a fortune that bought him nothing and a name that had become a curse on the lips of everyone who had ever known him. There is a reason the show named one of these final, devastating chapters after a famous old poem. That poem describes a once mighty king who built enormous monuments to his own greatness and commanded the world to look upon his works and despair. But the poem is set long after the king is gone, and all that remains of his vast empire is a broken statue half buried in an endless desert, with nothing around it but flat and empty sand stretching to the horizon. The greatness crumbled. The monuments fell. The mighty works became ruins in the dust. The choice of that name for Walt's downfall was perfect, because that is exactly what happened to him. He had built an empire to prove that he was great, and the empire crumbled into the desert just like the king's. The fortune scattered, the family shattered, the partner enslaved, the brother-in-law dead in the sand. The empire business had produced, in the end, a kingdom made entirely of ruins. This is the full price of never stopping, finally laid out where it can be seen. Every door Walt refused carried a cost, and all those costs came due together in one merciless stretch. And here is the bitterest irony in the whole story. Everything Walt claimed to be protecting was destroyed by his refusal to stop protecting it. The family he did it all for was torn to pieces by his own hands. The money he built it all for was stolen away in an afternoon. The greatness he had hungered for since he was a young man turned into the most complete and humiliating ruin imaginable. A man who had walked away at any one of a dozen open doors could have kept at least some of what he loved. By refusing every single one of them, Walter White lost it all. The very last thing he lost was the comforting lie. For years he had told himself and his wife and his partner and anyone who would listen that he was a good man doing terrible things for the sake of his family. That story had been the wall he hid behind, the thing that let him sleep, the justification for every door he slammed. But a man standing alone in the wreckage of everything he ever had, with his family gone and his empire reduced to dust, and his name a curse, can no longer hide behind that wall. There was nothing left to protect. There was no one left to do it for. The lie had run out of places to stand. And so the story moved toward its final scene, toward the last conversation Walter White would ever have with the woman he had married, in which the truth he had spent 5 years refusing to speak would finally have nowhere left to hide. Stripped of his money, his family, his health, and his lies, the dying man would return one last time to say the thing he had never been able to say. The real answer to the question that had haunted the entire story. The truth about why he could never stop, spoken plainly, in his own words, at the very end of everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the empire built to prove one man's greatness crumbled into desert ruins, taking his family, his fortune, his partner, and his brother-in-law down with it, until nothing remained but a dying man alone in the cold. The comforting lie had run out of places to hide. Next comes the final conversation, and the plain and honest words in which Walt at last admitted the truth about why he could never stop. Section 10. I did it for me. There is a long and lonely road that leads a man home to die, and Walter White traveled the whole length of it in the dead of winter. After everything had been taken from him, after the desert had swallowed his fortune and his brother-in-law, and his family had cast him out, he ended up hidden away in a freezing cabin far to the north, alone with the cancer that was finally finishing the job it had started years before.
He had barrels of money and no one to give it to. He had a name the whole country now knew, and every person who knew it wished he were dead. He had reached the absolute bottom of the life he had built, and from down there, in the cold and the silence, he made one last decision. He would go back. He would settle a few final accounts, see the people he had wrecked one last time, and bring the story to an end on his own terms. The journey home was the journey of a ghost, a dying man returning to the ruins of a kingdom that had already crumbled into sand. The first thing he set out to do, once he made it back to New Mexico, closed a circle that had been open since the very first chapter of his story. Walt wanted to get his remaining money to his son, the millions he had left after the gang took the rest. And the way he chose to do it reached all the way back to the wound at the root of everything. He went to Gretchen and Elliot, the couple from Gray Matter, the people whose success had haunted him for 20 bitter years. The very company he had walked away from for $5,000 when he was young and proud and afraid. He frightened them, using a clever and elaborate bluff, into agreeing to pass his remaining fortune to his son, dressed up as a generous charitable gift from their company on the boy's 18th birthday. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The man who had sold his share of Gray Matter for almost nothing, who had checked its rising worth for 2 decades like a man pressing on an old bruise, who had built an entire empire partly out of his refusal to ever walk away from greatness again, now forced that same company to become the vehicle that would carry his own fortune to his child. The wound that had opened the whole story and the ending of the story finally touched. Gray Matter had taken his future once. Now Gray Matter would deliver what was left of it to his son. There was something almost unbearably fitting in it. The bitterness of his youth bent at last into a strange kind of use. But the moment that truly ended the story, the moment everything had been building toward for 5 long years, was quieter than all of that. It happened in a small room, between a husband and a wife who had once loved each other and now barely had anything left to say. Walt came to see Skylar one final time. He was a shadow of the man she had married, gray and hollowed out and clearly dying, a ghost slipping into her kitchen to say goodbye. He gave her what she needed to protect herself from the law, the location where the authorities could find Hank's body, a piece of information she could trade for some measure of safety. He had thought of that, even at the end. And then they stood there together, 2 people surrounded by the wreckage of the life they had shared. And Skylar, worn down to nothing, told him that she could not survive hearing the old story one more time. The story where all of it, every terrible thing, had been done for the family. She had heard it too many times. She could not bear to hear it again. So this time, Walt gave her a different answer. For the first time in the entire story, he told her the truth. He told her, plainly and quietly, that he had done it for himself. He had liked it. He had been good at it. And doing it had made him feel alive. Those were the words. After 5 years of dressing every crime in the language of love and duty, after killing and lying and destroying everything around him while insisting it was all for the people he cared about, Walter White finally set the cover story down
and said the thing that had been true the whole time. The confession was almost gentle. It carried no anger and no excuse. It was simply, at long last, honest. Each piece of that confession is the answer to a question this story has been asking from the beginning, and each piece points straight back to the wound at the start. He did it for himself. The family had always been the story he told, the noble explanation that let him feel good about himself and kept the people around him from looking too closely. The love was real. The fear for them was real. But underneath the love and the fear lived a hunger that had nothing to do with anyone but Walter White. And at the end, he finally named it. He did it for himself. He liked it. Think back to the early days, when Jesse first asked him why a respectable man would risk everything to cook drugs, and Walt admitted that the work made him feel awake. The thrill of the danger, the pleasure of the power, the deep satisfaction of being feared and obeyed, all of it lit something in him that years of ordinary life had left cold. He enjoyed it. That simple, terrible fact sat underneath everything. And most people never want to believe that a man could do such monstrous things, partly because they felt good. He was good at it. Here is the piece that aches the most. Walter White had spent 20 years believing he was a wasted genius, a brilliant mind trapped in a small and overlooked life. A man whose talent the world had failed to recognize. The classroom had been a cage. The car wash had been a humiliation. And then he discovered that there was one thing he could do better than almost anyone alive. One arena where his genius was not wasted, but celebrated. Where his product was famous and his skill was legendary. The drug world gave him the recognition that the ordinary world never had. For a man starved of acknowledgement for 2 decades, being the best at something, anything, was a feeling more powerful than any drug he ever cooked. And he was alive. This is the deepest piece of all, and it explains the whole story. The small, invisible teacher Walt had been for so many years had been living a kind of slow death, going through the motions of a life that gave him no joy and no meaning, fading a little more each year. The Empire changed that. The danger and the power and the mastery made him feel real, made him feel present, made him feel like he existed in a way he had not felt since he was a young man with the whole world in front of him. He had been dead inside long before the cancer ever arrived. The crime brought him back to life. And once that is understood, the answer to the entire question finally comes clear. Why could Walter White never stop? Because stopping meant going back to not being alive. Stopping meant returning to the man in the metal reflection, the one he had punched until his knuckles bled, the small and forgotten teacher who had sold his future for $5,000. Stopping meant giving up the only thing that had ever made him feel like the great man he was certain he was meant to be. A person does not walk away from the single thing that makes them feel alive, no matter how high the cost climbs, no matter who gets hurt, no matter how many doors stand open. For Walter White, quitting was a kind of death far worse than the cancer, because the cancer only threatened to end his body, while quitting threatened to end the self he had finally become. He clung to the Empire because the Empire was the only place he had ever truly lived. The whole long story bends toward that single confession, and every chapter of it was a necessary step on the way. It began with a proud young man who sold his share of a company and spent the rest of his life unable to forgive himself, nursing a private bitterness while telling himself he had been wronged. The cancer arrived and handed that buried hunger both a permission and a disguise, a reason he could say out loud, the family, and a number he could point to, the careful sum he claimed would let him stop. The first killing, slow and considered in a dark basement, proved that he could cross any line and keep on living afterward. Then his cancer went into remission, and the excuse vanished. And a man who was only ever in it for his family would have wept with relief and walked away, while Walt smashed his own reflection, because the door out terrified him more than the disease. To survive in the life he refused to leave, he built a second self, gave it a great man's name and a dark hat, and slowly let that fearless stranger grow until it had soaked all the way through him and become his own face. In his own kitchen, with no disguise on, he told his frightened wife that he was not the kind of man who gets shot at his door, but the kind who knocks. And he watched her flee with their child rather than feel safe beside him, his pride hardening into the very center of who he was. When his partners offered him a clean fortune simply to walk away, far more than he had ever set out to earn, he refused it and told them, in plain words, that he was in the empire business, naming his true goal at last, even as he pretended not to. Every exit anyone ever offered him, he slammed shut, killing the one man who told him the truth and letting a young woman die to keep his grip, until the prison he lived in was revealed to be one he had built and locked himself. And then the bill came due all at once, and the empire crumbled into desert ruins, taking his fortune and his family and his brother-in-law and his partner down with it, until nothing remained but a dying ghost in a frozen cabin. The honesty at the very end was earned by all the dishonesty that came before it. Walt could only tell the truth once everything the lie had been protecting was already gone. With no family left to do it for, and no empire left to hold, and no future left to ruin, there was finally nothing standing between Walter White and the truth about himself. The confession was the last thing he had left to give, and so he gave it. His final hours played out the way the story always promised they would. Walt's last real act was to return to the compound of the gang that had taken everything from him, where they had also enslaved Jesse and forced him to cook. Using a weapon he had hidden and rigged with the same patient cleverness he had always brought to his chemistry, Walt cut the gang down and freed his old partner. Jesse, given the chance to kill the man who had ruined his life, refused to do it, and Walt let him go. The two of them parting without words, in the place where their strange and broken partnership finally ended. Walt himself had been struck by a bullet in the gunfire, and he knew it was over. He spent his last minutes wandering through the gang's lab, among the gleaming tanks and tools of the trade that had made him feel alive, touching the equipment almost tenderly. And there, surrounded by the instruments of the only work that had ever made him feel like someone, with a faint and peaceful look on his face, Walter White lay down and died, as the police arrived too late to take him. He died at rest, because he had finally stopped lying. Even the name of that final chapter carried a hidden meaning, the way so much of this story did. It was an anagram, the letters of the word finale rearranged into something new, a last small puzzle from a show that loved chemistry and secrets. Some who studied it noticed that the same letters also spelled out the chemical symbols for iron, lithium, and sodium, which could be read as blood, the drug, and tears, the three things the whole story had been made of. It was a fitting final touch, a quiet bit of cleverness for a man whose entire downfall had begun with his love of the periodic table. The story leaves behind a question larger than Walter White himself, and it is worth sitting with at the end. The most dangerous lie a person can ever tell is the one that makes their own desires sound noble. Walt's claim that he did it all for his family was so convincing that he believed it himself for years. And so did a great many of the people watching his story. The lie worked because it had truth mixed into it. Because he really did love his family and really was afraid for them. And that thread of truth made the whole garment easy to wear. The man who created the show has reflected, in the years since it ended, on exactly this.
He has said that as time passes, the spell the character once cast begins to wear off, and what becomes visible underneath is a man who was deeply full of himself, with an ego the size of an entire state. A man who was forever convinced that he was the victim of his own life, even as he victimized everyone around him. The creator has even admitted that the whole story was told through Walt's eyes, which is part of why so many viewers rooted for him and blamed the people closest to him, especially his wife, who only ever tried to stop the destruction. That is the real lesson buried inside the story of Walter White, and it reaches far beyond any one show or any one character. It is a study of how easily a person can dress up their pride as love. It is a portrait of how the hunger to matter, to be recognized, to feel important and alive, can hide behind the respectable language of duty and family and sacrifice. And it is a warning about how a man can burn down everything he claims to cherish, while telling himself the whole time that he is protecting it. Walt did not set out to become a monster. He set out to provide for his family before he died. But underneath that decent intention sat a starving need that had been waiting 20 years for its chance. And once it got loose, no amount of money, and no clean exit, and no pleading from the people he loved could ever satisfy it. Because what it wanted was not a thing that could be bought or finished. It wanted to feel alive, and only the Empire could give it that. So in the end, the gentle answer to the hard question is also the saddest one. Walter White was never truly a monster from the beginning, whatever the darkest readings of the show might suggest. He was an ordinary, disappointed, proud man who had spent half his life feeling small and overlooked and cheated, and who was handed, all at once, a death sentence and a chance to finally be the person he had always believed he was meant to be. He found, in the worst possible place, the thing he had been missing for 20 years. The feeling of being great, of being feared, of being the best, of being awake and alive and real. And having found it, he could not let it go. Not for his wife, not for his children, not for his own safety, not even for his own life. He could never stop, because the Empire was the only place he had ever felt like himself. And a man will give up almost anything before he gives up that. The mercy of the ending, if there is one, is that the truth finally set him free. For 5 years he had run from the simple fact of who he was, hiding behind a story about family that grew thinner every season. And in his last conversation with his wife, with everything already lost and nothing left to protect, he stopped running. He told her the truth, the plain and human and terrible truth, that he had done it for himself, that he had liked it, that he had been good at it, that it had made him feel alive. And the moment those words left his mouth, the weight he had carried for so long seemed to lift. He had spent the whole story unable to stop. The one thing he finally managed to set down, at the very end, was the lie. And once it was gone, he was free to lie down among the tools of his trade, and finally, peacefully, rest. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.